so much for coming. I can't express how excited I am. Maybe that should do it for you, because that was amazing. Although what you don't get to see are the two elephants that get to stare at me for the night from this beautiful podium, actually. I have to first start off, obviously, by thanking you all for being here. I hope that this discussion will both generate a conversation after, but also will spark people's imagination about new ways of organizing, which is what I really, really try to do in the book, is say that actually we're in a situation where we need to consider new ways of organizing, new ways of building community, and I also try to explain some of the experiences that I had while I was working in the student movement and organizing students, why it was so difficult to organize students, and why it is even more difficult for the labor movement to organize students. But before I get into that, I have to thank, first of all, the CCPA made this entire project possible. So the CCPA is a huge benefit to all of us, obviously, but me in particular. And so they were excellent throughout this process. Tonight I have to thank, of course, the People's Co-op Bookstore, Mike for helping to make this happen, and folks at Rabble were really, really helpful. The Hospital Employees Union is also thank you so much for your generous support. And if you're with an organization that wants to also provide generous support and you haven't yet, you just let me know. We are selling books, and they make an excellent gift. Or 10 gifts even, and so there you go. I spent a lot of time making presentations, and this is probably the most scripted I have to be, because I will be reading from the book. And so if you have a copy and I'm boring, you should just try to find where I am. But if you really, really like it, hopefully you'll obviously want to read a little bit more. But the parts of the book that I pulled out, I thought were really good illustrations of what I was trying to argue. When I was in Winnipeg last night, the introduction said, well, this is a book that I wrote for my generation to talk to young people at unions. And that's true, but it's also kind of a Trojan horse, where the message is really for folks in leadership right now, it's for folks in union leadership right now, to say, I think that this is where we've got it wrong, and I think that this is what needs to change. And to try to do that in a way that's respectful, and that respects the contributions, of course, that everyone brings to the union, and to build cross-generational solidarity. I have to apologize, I'm going to be using terms like old people and young people. I don't mean to be pejorative when I say young people. Or old people. I have some definitions too. I kind of separate it between older folks being 40 and up, younger folks being 40 and under. And I don't mean young at heart, I mean like when you came out of the womb, which is something I have on my mind a lot right now. Not of you, but of myself. And so I do talk about older folks, younger folks. I don't, hopefully anyone who is offended by that can at least be the other at heart and feel good. And so, so just a little bit about me and why I'm writing a book about this. So I spent 9 years working in the student movement, mostly in Ontario. And so I was a student of journalism and public administration at Ryerson University in Toronto. I did my Master's of Education at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And now I currently live in Quebec City. And so my points of political contact are actually quite diverse. British Columbia is probably the place I get the least. So if you also want to give me a lesson after, like we can Skype for days and you can explain it to me maybe. But I think that a lot of these lessons are generalizable, and within the book I really wanted to capture what has happened in Canada in the last 5 years. Because I figured that after writing a book, if my thesis is rejected in 7 words, at least you can use this as examples of what has happened, the attacks that we've been under in the last 5 years. And so I actually stick with a lot of mainstream media coverage to talk about labor strife or labor disputes, and I try to draw and generalize a lot of solutions or ideas from that. The book has a couple of different sections. The first section is, if you've read it, and I would be amazed if anyone's read it, so I'm not, that's cool, you don't have to like go, oh, I haven't read it yet, it's like, obviously. It's new.
They got there at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, I got in at 5 o'clock, so there's at least like one person that's read it, right? The first 4 chapters is really reads like a how-to of unions. It assumes that young people actually don't have any idea. Like when people talk about a strike and the importance of going on strike or the importance of a picket line, I assumed that that point of contact is not there, that they probably didn't have parents that went on strike, or if they did, it wasn't necessarily something that they talked about. And so that's really where a lot of people say, ah yes, this is a book targeted towards youth. But from chapters 6 to 11, I actually look at a lot of the attacks on youth that have completely and fundamentally changed how young people understand community, how they understand working together, social solidarity, and what kind of problems this poses for the labor movement. Because I think that is actually fundamental to this question. When I was working with students and young people, I would read the Globe and Mail consistently saying that young people don't care, they're not voting, that's statistically true, they're disenfranchised, and they're entitled, right? It's all about me and all this kind of stuff. But when you're organizing on the ground, there isn't a single student that you say, hey, what do you think about war, that's going to say, I don't care about war. They have an opinion. Young people have an opinion. And so what was this disconnect happening where an older generation is looking at a younger generation and not understanding how things have changed? And what that's led to, I think, is that we actually need to start translating the experiences of older people and younger people so that we understand that my experience is not the experience that my parents had. And my parents cannot say, well, we worked really, really hard. I worked at an open pit mine for the summers, and I paid my tuition fees off, and it was really, really hard, and you have to work hard too. That's true. My father did do that. But he made enough money to pay for his education this summer. And I painted houses one summer for 12 hours a day, and it didn't come close to paying my tuition fees. What has happened? Well, the context has completely changed. And so this book is also, I hope, a launching pad for us to be able to have that conversation and to say, we get it, things are different, and because things are different, a generation of labor leaders that come from a different context are not speaking the language that I think they need to speak to today's youth. So, what I thought I should do, like I said, book launches is not, like usually I'm up here with like a electric guitar and a band, so this is totally weird. I figured that reading was probably what I was supposed to do, because it's like a book launch and we're all literary folks. And so I thought that I would start off with chapter 6, which is called Neoliberalism, Dividing and Conquering Canadians. And I wanted to talk about neoliberalism in a way that, first of all, you didn't have to have a degree to get it, because I think that one of our problems, especially on the left, is you expect that people have degrees and understand these terms. I wanted to break it down for people in a way that they can go, oh, that's what they mean by that. That's what neoliberalism is, or that's the effect that it's had on our community. And so the first thing I think is so important to mention is that people of my generation have never known anything other than a neoliberal state. They've never known anything other than me, it's my responsibility if I succeed, it's my responsibility if I fail. And that is so isolating, and that is so destructive. And so when the labor movement tries to rely on notions of solidarity and say to a young person, well, it's your community, you have to get involved for your community, it doesn't mean anything, because we don't come from communities anymore. Unless you're deeply rooted in an ethnic or religious community that is also not necessarily going to expand past a couple of days a week or your family or whatever, you don't have community. And in the student movement, one of the things I think that we figured out at the Canadian Federation of Students was that we were building community on campus just to be able to talk to students about their power. And the process of building community is a radical process, but it is hard, and it takes a lot of work. And it also looks very different, I think, today than it ever has. I start off with a story in the introduction about my family who's got a dairy farm in southern Ontario, and that they had to rely on each other because they couldn't afford to own certain piece of farm equipment. They relied on each other to combine their corn and their grains, and we don't even rely on each other for things we need anymore, because it's all our fault. And if we succeed, we're successful, and if we don't, well, there's shame, and no one wants to feel shame. And so I'm going to read from chapter 6 a little bit about this effect. And I think it's kind of weird that the best explanation of this I found was from Russell Brand, who's like, I don't know, after he did Arthur, that movie that was so bad I turned it off on a plane, that he's like coming out as being one of the most interesting writers, and most interesting writers about Generation X actually right now. He's a British comedian, and yeah, Google him if you're not totally sure who Russell Brand is. He's worth looking for. And so this section talks a little bit about the attack on community that happened in England, and I think it's just as relevant for us in Canada. For people who are too young to engage in politics, but who would be infected forever by Thatcher's decisions, the war she waged against her community in England has arguably enabled her neoliberal policies to take root. Her death also provided the opportunity for reflection about what her legacy meant. Russell Brand, actor and comedian, explained his perception of the Iron Lady and her soldiers like this: "I'd unthinkingly imbibed enough doctrine to know that, troubled as I was, there was little point looking elsewhere for support. I was on my own. We were all on our own. Norman Tebbit, one of Thatcher's acolytes, said when the National Union of Mine Workers eventually succumbed to the military onslaught and starvation over which she presided, we didn't just break the strike, we broke the spell." The spell he was referring to is the unseen bond that connects us all and prevents us from being subjugated by tyranny, the spell of community. And then I go on. Through the implementation of policies meant to break community, the spell of community has indeed been broken and remains under constant attack. For Brand, this attack on community was Thatcher's legacy. Perhaps my early apathy and indifference are a result of what Thatcher deliberately engendered, the idea that there is no such thing as society, that we are all alone on our journey through life, solitary atoms of consciousness. And so I think that it's really important because that really does capture a lot of how young people grow up. And so for the labor movement, to be able to know that that's the framework that a lot of young people have, like when they're looking at organizations, it helps to explain why, for a lot of young people, they'll say, you know, like they'll hate corporations, they'll hate government, they'll hate unions, because they're all the same thing, even though one's trying to protect you at work and increase your salary and give you benefits, and one's trying to screw you over. Somehow that has all become the same thing, and people target it in the same way. The natural result of the community breakdown can be seen throughout popular culture and what society deems to be valuable today. Author and journalist Christopher Hedges argues that the celebrity culture that dominates the United States is the extension of the obliteration of community, where the individual is at the center of all aspects of society. He refers to this as the cult of the self, where people strive to promote themselves above the needs of all others. This cult of the self has been fed and nurtured by corporations who target individuals to purchase their goods through relentless advertising. Part of this damage is the personal accumulation of debt. At the end of 2012, Canadian consumer debt mostly owed through credit cards, which does not include mortgage borrowing, reached $477 billion. When mortgages are considered, Canadian household debt represented 165% of household spending. This means that, on average, Canadians owe 65% more than they earn. In the Greater Toronto Area, Canada's most populous region, a report from researchers at McMaster University and the United Way Toronto found that just half of adults had full-time secured jobs. And part of that report also indicated that a good chunk of the fault of that statistic falls on the shoulders of universities and colleges who have stopped basically hiring full-time workers, especially colleges in the Greater Toronto Area. Of the people working full-time, 22.5% of them had no benefits, did not have regular working hours, or had no job security beyond the next 12 months. Racialized people and immigrants who had been in Canada for less than 20 years were more likely to be in precarious work. So too were young people aged 25 to 35 and people over 55. Unsurprisingly, folks working in precarious jobs stated that they were less likely to be involved in community events, like attending meetings or volunteer at their children's schools. They were also more likely to delay having children. If this alone is what faces workers, particularly young workers in Canada, it would be bad enough. But decades of regressive policies on higher education spending in all Canadian provinces except Newfoundland, Labrador, and Quebec have created another crisis that further exacerbates these realities and creates a new class of indentured workers. And so when we're talking to people about trying to get them involved and saying, like, look, if you vote, it matters, these are the pressures that they're facing, and no amount of voting is going to necessarily fix it, because our system is so rotten. And I think it's something that we all know, and we all have our own ways to be involved in trying to change that and trying to steer the ship in another way. But if you're young and you've only known this, it makes it completely theoretical to be told, you know what, we can fight for eliminating student debt. I was on a campus, a college campus in Chatham, Ontario, which is a border town in southwestern Ontario. And to tell the college students there what the students in Quebec were doing at the time they were on strike, their eyes fell out of their heads. They're like, what do you mean they're not going to class? Well, they're not going to class, they're protesting class. What do you mean they don't pay tuition fees? They don't pay tuition fees because the Quebec system of college is free. What do you mean their system of college is free? I pay $4,000, sister. You know, it's so unbelievably difficult for them to understand. Meanwhile, this is a group of people, they were all women, all young women. I think of the 6 of them, 3 of them had children, they were under the age of 21, and they're all trying to go to school and be elected to their student union. And just as they started to get radicalized, what did the college administration do? They expelled one, they suspended another, and they changed the locks in the student union office because we don't have protections for autonomy for student unions in Ontario. It's a bit different in this province. And so these tactics that are being used in isolated instances like that, we see them across sector, of course. But for young people who are already vulnerable to these attacks, they can be even more devastating because you've tried and you fail. And then no amount of someone saying, no, but you got to keep trying because it'll work. It worked in this country, it worked in this province, it worked generations ago. Doesn't matter. We've tried and we failed. And I got kids to feed, and I don't have time to be able to dedicate my life to changing the world. So I think that's a really difficult reality of a lot of young people that the labor movement needs to have a debate about. How do we talk to young people then? How do we get them involved in our unions? Are these structural barriers, are we considering them when we're organizing our meetings or when we have our positions, or when the president of the Canadian Labour Council Congress was elected in 1999, which I was in grade 9 when that happened, and I'm not that young, I'm 29 now. Like, what does that mean for the labor movement when there's no real high levels of, or high positions for young people to get involved? Especially when it's those older folks who are involved now who did get involved when they were 20 and 21. They had those formative years in the 1970s that were so important to making them passionate and dedicated unionists, right? They stayed until today, and I think that they need to be applauded for that. But we need to imagine new ways. Then, are there new positions we need to create for young people? How do we create space to get young people into these positions? So that's a little bit on the neoliberalism part. The other part that I want to highlight tonight is the attacks on civil liberties, because I think the attacks on civil liberties that have been waged against different social movements, and the attacks on civil liberties that have been waged against unions, are all the same kind of attacks, but we don't often draw those links together. And so I spent a bit of time in the book talking about how neoliberalism has made these attacks possible, where people kind of go, okay, yeah, like maybe we should have to tell the police in advance when we protest. Okay, why? Well, because of the police, right? They're there to protect us. Like, they'll stop the traffic. Okay. But one of the things that was so obvious, the G20 in Toronto, it was not, the G20 in Toronto was disgusting for a lot of reasons. But the thing that was the most shocking to me, as I was standing on the Saturday at Queen's Park, which was the designated protest zone, we were all there and we're designatedly protesting. There's about 1,000 of us. There's about 4,000 police, we figured. And what was happening was they were practicing a training routine against us. They were practicing with new equipment. They were practicing new techniques of crowd control. And it was so obvious that they're practicing that at some point we were all like, okay, they're still coming, they're still coming. Oh my God, they kidnapped that guy, okay, run. And people were like, they thought that they were going to get killed, and it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. But they didn't know what they were doing either. It really was a practice. And I think that the attacks on our civil liberties that have accelerated over the last couple of years for the labor movement that is really, really damaging, because it means that it's preying on people who already don't have the confidence to stand up against these repressive attacks, and preying on people who are just happy to have a job, because that is a narrative that a lot of people buy into. It's a completely fair narrative, because actually, yes, a lot of people are just happy to have a job. And so I try to tie these two things together for labor activists and for average people to say, no, when these attacks on civil liberties need to be not only stopped and condemned, but we need to push back against them. But we also need to make those links and to have the solidarity between movements to be able to say that the encroachments are getting worse. I remember learning, I'm going to read this passage in a bit, and it mentions this, but I remember learning about the October crisis in grade 7 history. And my teacher was like, this was the craziest thing that's ever happened in Canada. Like, all these people got arrested. Like, we had no rights. It was wild. And we're like, wow, no rights, cool. But as I'm going to read, like, we have surpassed that in spectacular ways since 1970. So this chapter is called Civil Unrest and Attacks on Citizen Freedoms. And I thought it was so important to try and talk about this in a labor context, although I'm not sure if the sections will come out, so this will be like a teaser. You get to read the rest on your own. Unless I read it on tape and then you can listen to it. But no one's asked me to do that yet, unfortunately. Neoliberalism was sold to people around the world as a political system that would offer citizens more freedom. Freedom to choose where they spend money, how to spend, which services to buy, and from where. As the policies of the past 30 years have firmly rooted themselves within all Canadian governments, it's clear that the promise of freedom was guaranteed to only a few, corporations and the ultra-rich. For the average person, rather than having an existence that's marked by more freedom, people's freedoms to choose are more limited than they have been in decades. Personal debt has severely constrained personal economic choice, and new laws that prohibit personal freedoms and movement have been introduced with more frequency. Part of what has enabled this to happen is the distortion of language and false dichotomies presented to Canadians as their only choices, and unfortunately they're presented to Canadians through sources that they trust, like the CBC or the national news media. It was this kind of logic that Public Safety Minister Vic Tays used when he tried to pass deeply troubling internet surveillance legislation. He tried to create the fake dichotomy between being on the side of the government and therefore supporting policies that would give the government broad powers to watch Canadians' internet browsing activities, or on the side of the child pornographers, the Canadians fighting to defend personal privacy from inappropriate government spying. The use of such charged rhetoric didn't work. Canadians rallied against the legislation and against Tays personally, and it was abandoned. And he's now gone. Yay! That worked. Okay. So as long as we've got clever people with access to court documents and dirt on conservative politicians, then we'll always win. This language has crept into labor discussions too, helping to justify extreme actions that would have a decade ago seemed unthinkable. For example, during the debate on the Canada Post Back to Work legislation, Bill C-6, and the NDP's marathon filibuster that tried to delay the implementation of the bill, Conservative members of Parliament responded to the NDP's arguments against the Back to Work legislation. One comment, illustrative of the Conservatives' understanding of justice, reminded Canadians that for the federal government, labor disputes must be stopped not because they hurt workers, their families, the businesses that rely on their disposable income, or the health of their community members, but because they cut into corporate profits. Joyce Smith, member of Parliament for Kildonan and St. Paul in Minnesota, made a statement that starts as if it were a condemnation of widespread poverty and ends as if it's a punchline for a satire making fun of right-wing ideology. Quote, "It is a very sad day for Canada when we see the suffering that is happening outside of these walls, out on the streets in our cities and rural areas across this nation, because the mail is being held up. Businesses are being hurt." Right from Hansard, it's just poetic. Suffering in the streets because the mail has stopped, and the mail has stopped because a corporation under the control of the federal government has locked out its workers. The circular logic was astounding. It isn't a coincidence that extreme encroachments into labor relations processes have been happening the same time as other attacks on Canadians' freedoms. During the past few years, there has been a marked increase in the use of law to stifle people's dissent outside of the workplace or their membership in a union. Before 1910, the largest mass arrests in Canada had happened during 1970, when the federal government implemented the War Measures Act to give police the power to search and detain Quebecers without having a warrant. In the aftermath of what became known as the October Crisis, more than 450 people were detained. Most were released without a charge laid. To investigate the legality of detaining people without a charge, 2 commissions determined that the actions of the RCMP during the October Crisis were illegal. Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa later admitted that the imposition of the War Measures Act was done more to gain popularity for the authorities with the sympathetic Canadian population than to stop the apparent insurrection. During the past 5 years, governments have used the same tactics as those implemented during the October Crisis with alarming frequency. During the G20 protests in June 2010 in Toronto, civil rights were effectively suspended through the instatement and misinterpretation of the Public Works Protection Act, a piece of provincial legislation that was meant to protect public buildings during the 1930s. This special law, combined with greater powers given to the 20,000 police officers who descended on Toronto, resulted in the arrest of more than 1,100 people that weekend alone. Nearly all of the charges were eventually dropped, but not after lengthy and expensive legal procedures. The Ontario government faced no sanctions for having allowed the mass arrest and unlawful detention of people that weekend. The G20 protests created a higher watermark for what was acceptable for the criminalization of dissent, but that watermark would be surpassed by the repression that the provincial and municipal governments in Quebec would inflict during the student protests in 2012. Over the course of the protests, laws were enacted that made arresting protesters easier, including laws that forbade protests in parks at night in Quebec City, Montreal's mask ban, and Law 78, which made protesting in a group of more than 50 people without telling the police in advance illegal. In total, 3,418 people were arrested during the Maple Spring. Law 78 was repealed when the Parti Québécois was elected to replace the Liberal Party of Quebec in September 2012, but municipal laws stayed in place. At a demonstration to mark the 1-year anniversary of the largest protest in 2012, 294 people were arrested on March 22nd, and another 200 more were arrested in 2 other protests in March. Anarcho Panda, a Cégep professor who attends rallies in a panda costume to demonstrate how outrageous it is for government to ban wearing masks at rallies, had the head of his costume confiscated by the Montreal police nearly a year after the end of the student strikes in April 2013. He had to spring for the head to get it. Just as in labor relations, where laws already exist that state when a strike is legal or illegal, the Canadian Criminal Code already states that it is a crime to wear a disguise for the purpose of committing a crime. The municipal law has more to do with limiting the freedom of protesters to express themselves through demonstration than it does to protect public safety. The federal Conservatives liked the powers that this new law granted to police so much that they quietly passed a federal version. Just before MPs left Ottawa for the 2013 summer holidays, the federal Conservative government passed its own mask ban law, making it illegal for Canadians to wear masks at what the Conservatives call riots or unlawful assemblies. The motion, served by Conservative member for Wildrose, Alberta, Blake Richards, carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in jail, the minimum sentence for second-degree murder. This law is a pure attack on civil liberties. Wearing a disguise with the intention of breaking the law was already a crime in Canada. Now, if someone wears a mask to a protest to protect against tear gas at a rally, or if a worker joins a protest wearing a mask to conceal his or her identity from their employer, for example, they could face 10 years in jail. Attacks against workers and attacks against protesters are dreamed up by the same masterminds. The people who believe that personal freedom and one's right to criticize the state are trumped by protecting politicians, the wealthy, and the pursuit of profits. Whether it's stopping workers from unionizing, legislating workers back to work during a legal strike or lockout, or arresting people who are demonstrating to oppose a tuition fee increase, these strategies are meant to maintain and protect the current power structures. When people become more aware and start pushing back, the methods used become more oppressive, just like having nearly 3,500 students arrested over the course of a few months. Now, earlier in that chapter, I talk a lot about the Cup W strike, and so that kind of also sets a bit of the context for the attacks that the labor movement had felt as a result of a strike action. So, the last thing I want to mention, the last thing I want to talk about is, I think, is probably the most difficult subject for the labor movement to deal with, which is, what is the role that the labor movement has played in creating this system that we are all now trying to fight? What is the role of the labor movement? What role has the labor movement played in actually creating and maintaining capitalism, right? And so, I think that this is an important question, because tied with this question is, what can the labor movement do? How can we reorganize ourselves to fight for new alternatives and new ways of doing things? When I was at the Canadian Federation of Students, one of the things that we created that I think is probably the most impressive service that they offer is the bulk purchasing network of orientation materials, like T-shirts and clipboards and stuff that student unions buy in huge quantities. And the Canadian Federation of Students created a not-for-profit buying consortium where they were able to buy union-made or fairly made clothes and water bottles or whatever, and actually offer it to their members with profit cut out of it. So it was low cost, and it was ethical. And the units that they were producing were in the several hundreds of thousands, 300,000 a year in like T-shirts. And I think that those alternative models are something that we can consider. But that's going to take a lot of leadership change, a lot of strength from leaders, and a lot of potentially difficult conversations that we need to have, especially when we talk about things like pensions that are wrapped up in a system that is exploitative, and that are pensions that do better when the system is more exploitative. So this is a part of the last chapter that's under the heading called Organized Labor and the Fall of Capitalism, and I put a question mark there because I think the jury is out. I don't think that the death knell has tolled for capitalism yet. There are many theories about where Western nations find themselves in the life cycle of capitalism. Struggling American cities that were once manufacturing powerhouses offer to some the proof that capitalism there is nearing the end of its reign. If this theory is true, or even to be considered, it must be asked, what role have unions, their workers, and their leaders played throughout this process of its demise? The claim that capitalism means infinite production capacities has definitely been challenged by the downsizing of the manufacturing sector, but have workers themselves bought into this rhetoric too? Has this limited how unions approach organizing? Richard Wolff, writing in The Guardian, argues that Detroit is a perfect example of the limits of capitalism. He examines the roles played by automakers that helped to both launch the city into affluence in the 1960s and drop it into total despair today. He asks if the outcome would be different had the unions seized the opportunity when the decline had started to organize themselves in different ways. He argues that workers' cooperatives may have helped force the big three automakers to better distribute their money, becoming more competitive with Japanese and European automakers, and push for better technologies, if they were going to benefit from these technologies directly. He suggests that workers' cooperatives would have likely switched to producing and helped to promote mass transit vehicles or other alternatives to the automobile to retain jobs and well-being once they saw the continued automobile production could not secure those priorities for workers. While it might be too late for workers in Detroit to save the auto industry there, workers in other automaking cities, especially in Canada, have a lot to learn. And of course that it extends not just to the auto industry, but manufacturing in general. Should the unionized workers at Chrysler, General Motors, or other plants demand to change the very structure of their companies during the next round of bargaining, could that be the difference that saves Canada's auto industry? There is no question that capitalism is in crisis, and if the measure of a crisis is the effect that it's had on the people, there's no doubt that capitalism is not helping workers, even if it is still working for corporations. But even to work for corporations, capitalism has required bailouts of hundreds of billions of dollars of public money to correct for massive market failures. In a landscape that by design privileges the voices and demands of the powerful, how are workers supposed to interact with the current economic system that they themselves are a part of and helped build? Unions and the labor of the people they represent are at the center of capital. In an era of widespread deregulation, they're the final roadblock to total profit-generating madness. How they play their political cards is the most important question that labor leaders, union members, their provincial and federal federations, and coalitions face. So that's a quick tour of the book. One of the things that that kind of roots me in the analyses that I make is the belief that in a majority government situation, the only real opposition that exists is the labor movement, and I say that because it's the only thing that is like locally democratic enough to take on the democracy of our governments. And so I think when we look at the Harper government and we're like, holy crow, like 2015, is he going to win again? Maybe, actually, maybe. When we're imagining how we stop that in the interim before the election where you can actually change parties, the answer should come from something that has democratically organized itself, that has its roots in workplaces, and that actually can take its leadership, take its direction from people on the ground. Of course, our unions are not necessarily the bastions of democracy that they should be, and part of this book is also talking about the need to address that. But there's no question that democracy is damaged when we have a lack of young people involved in those processes, and not just young people not just young people in positions of power, which is I think important, but also the industries that young people are in that are widely ununionized, non-unionized. And the final chapter also encourages people to look to the United States, where things I think are worse, although we're sliding towards that direction, and look at some of the strategies around our Walmart campaign or the fast food strikes that are possible ways that we can look at how we can move forward in Canada and talk to young people, get creative and imagine new ways to start bringing them into the labor movement that might look a little bit different than it did in the 1960s or 70s. So that's the book. And I hope we have a conversation now, but I also hope you really, really like it. So thank you very much.
I didn't realize Nora was the author, but we're sensibly sitting in the most comfortable chair in the room. Another difference between old and young, which you didn't really talk about that much. Nora said she learned about the Quebec crisis in grade 7 history. I learned about it in grade 7. Stick around, enjoy the ambiance, and hang around, enjoy yourselves.
Yeah, well, if there's any questions that folks have, because there is a lot of stuff in the book that I can't really take you all on a tour on, because I'm sure we could be here all night. But, yeah.
It's not so much a question as a sharing of experience. I spent 30 years in the paper workers union here in British Columbia as a Marxist, trying to build some kind of a democratic militant opposition somewhere in the trade union movement, in my local, in my union, in my region, in my country, anywhere. And was unsuccessful. I had people helping me. I was the editor of a local newsletter, which I made every effort every time we went to a convention or a conference to get people from other places on our mailing list. And this newsletter was primarily for things that happened in local, but also had commentary and criticism of the labor leadership and the NDP and stuff like that. Went everywhere, right? Not lots of good reviews every once in a while, but nothing. So there was a problem of demobilization of people that was different from people who were different. But there were also moments when that demobilization was overcome. In this province, in 1983, there was a struggle that erupted spontaneously when the government passed 22 pieces of legislation that attacked everybody simultaneously. Not because the labor movement led it, because the Communist Party called a movement. Now, I'm not a member of the Communist Party, nor ever would be, but they called a meeting one night, and 300 people showed up, and the labor movement said, okay, well, thanks for getting us bus running, we'll take over driving it now. And then they steered it over the curb and parked it, right? And in 2004, when your union courageously defied back-to-work legislation and ripping up their contracts and imposed imposition of a substandard contract, again there was a moment when hundreds of thousands of people across this province seriously considered breaking the law and going out and fighting shoulder to shoulder. And they were turned back to their workplaces without being able to do that by the labor leadership. Not by the government. By the labor leadership. So when you talk about democracy and the trade union movement, it's kind of like, yeah, it's democratic as long as you agree with them, or if you mildly criticize them, or if you're not very well organized. If you actually put together something that can challenge the hegemony of the labor leadership, you're not democratic at all.
Yeah, well, I think when I say that the labor movement is democratic, I think that we have to benchmark democracy based on what democracy means in Canada, right? And so if we look at what democracy is, it's supposed to be our governments, right? And I think that the state of our provincial and federal democracies are even worse than in the labor movement, right? And so the labor movement at least offers the structures, I think, for people to organize in a way that the federal government, until we change the voting system, at least until we change the voting system, and after that, even then, who knows, is not going to be the place where I think that workers will have the most power if they also have those structures within their workplaces. One of the things that I think that the labor movement has to do is imagine their workspaces as being beyond the walls of their workspaces, that their collective agreements cannot just be about benefits or the personal realities of what workers experience. It has to include, do we include a clause about forcing the boss to pay for a new park in our community, or to help actually open new centers or something? I don't know. We need to tie collective bargaining into things that are more broad, and that is a possible solution to be able to address some of the issues that I raise. And to do that, you have to use the democratic structures within a union. And I think that I know how difficult it is to change things, absolutely. But if we can start on a conversation where people agree at the fundamental level, yes, there's a problem. And I think of the prorogation stuff, the first prorogation stuff, right? That was a spark, and in Toronto at least, overnight, 20,000 people took the streets, right? But we didn't have a demand. There was no demand. There's nothing you could do because the government was shut down. So what the heck would the opposition parties can't do anything, or they could do some things, but they really couldn't do much, right? So what's the demand? Well, at least when you have got the labor movement, that should be able to then push on different pressure points like the means of production. Maybe then we can. But I totally, I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to make a comment. 'Cause one of the things I like best about your writing is the way that you link student movements and labor movements that are often at odds, it seems. And I know, for speaking personally, as a student in Montreal in 2006, it was, comes from Ontario. It was the very first time I ever saw government make something that people didn't like, and students set up and said, we don't want that, and they changed their mind. It was I'd never seen that before. It was something I'd never seen. So that moment kind of, for me, showed the kind of power that students can have, right? That is absent, like you say, in the rest of the country in a lot of ways. I'm a grad student at UBC. I'm also a member of the grad student teaching assistant union. And one of the things I think that is, I was just at the QBBC convention I don't know, a few months ago, and someone put forward a constitutional amendment to add a vice president, a young worker vice president, right? And I saw, I think the graceful term is I'm aged out of that category, but a lot of young people stood up and explained quite passionately why they wanted this position, only to be voted down by the older workers and executives in the room, right? Mm-hmm. And as someone who represents 3,000 members, we have 3,000 members in QB in my local in BC, and of course other QP locals at other universities have even more. It's a huge number of people, of young people who are just as passionate about labor issues and other democratic issues. But one of the things I see about the kind of potential of that body of power is that in 5 years we'll have 3,000 more people, right? That will also have maybe their first job, definitely the first union job, right? And these are people who are actually being sometimes with cause, because we can be difficult to organize, difficult to kind of, we're not in it for 30 or 40 years, so we're not in that place that other people, other unionized workers are. Mm-hmm. But it is this opportunity, I think, for leadership, like you say, to pay attention to young workers who are coming through this kind of, and if they only have this sometimes 2 years, sometimes 4 or 5 years, to have a unionized job and see what a union can do for people, if it can do something like that we've seen in Quebec, what young people and students can do, and I think that's a really big opportunity that I would like to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah.
On that kind of connection.
Quebec's a funny place because it's obviously for a lot of folks outside of Quebec, it's amazing, right? The stuff that we see happening, especially at the Maple Spring, it's amazing. But you look at the labor movement in Quebec, and it's probably the most institutionalized. They prop up the Parti Québécois consistently. They're embroiled in a Charbonneau Commission with mafia ties. Like it's a funny place. It's a very funny place. But I think that one of the most difficult aspects of this is we're so vulnerable because while young people, like one of the classic arguments is young people get mad about seniority, right? Seniority just makes sure that young people get jobs in unions. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true, but there's also a history to seniority, and why does seniority exist, and what does seniority do? But because the bosses, the management, the owners know that you can completely divide people based on age, they just go right in there, and so all of a sudden you have older folks who are working longer, who have no pensions or who can't retire when they thought that they would retire, who have to protect what they feel like they need to protect, and then younger workers who just can't get a job and can't get a break. It's so easy to exploit, and it has been exploited, and so I think that results in young workers saying, well, we want a VP position, and older workers being like, no, and sorry, vote against, right? I was at the Unifor convention, and I think they had one speaker who was under 30 in the whole convention. Like, and the room was mostly not under 30, like it was a lot of old folks there. Now there's also structural reasons for that, like you had to have been a delegate before to go to the convention, so that obviously was going to knock out a lot of younger workers, and they did that just because it was the new, like the old to the new convention, fine, whatever. But we have to recognize that young people have a lot of really legitimate concerns within the labor movement, and a lot of anxieties, but I think the older workers do too, and we're not doing a very good job talking together. One of the things I argue in the book is that we need to have a lot more cross-generational mentorship. And so that when you do have a young worker in a union for 2 years and you've got to make a good impression on them and they have to get it, where are the older workers being like, hey, let's go for a coffee, let's go for beer. Let me tell you about back when I didn't have mat leave and I got fired, right? Because we also take for granted a lot of the things that I think young people, like, that whole, like, thank a union for the weekend message. Like, I hate that message because it's like, first of all, most young people don't have weekends anymore. Or the weekend is Monday and Thursday. And second of all, it's like, what do you mean thank a weekend? Sunday was Sunday before the labor movement existed, right? Like it's just a completely different understanding of how things grew. And how else are people going to be able to know that if they don't have those relationships? But the other thing too is I think that it is politicizing for young people to try and push for stuff at convention and kind of fail, as long as there's good people around them to be like, okay, we are pushing in a direction. This is a longer process, and just because you don't see the results of your actions now, that doesn't mean that they don't come. It's a frustrating message, but in the student movement, Lord knows that's basically the only argument we had, which was you will not see the result. You are not fighting for your tuition fees to be lowered. You're fighting for the tuition fees of next year's students to be lowered, just like how the government increased the students' tuition fees for next year in Ontario because they knew that those students are not going to fight back because they just don't know any different. Did you still have a question there?
Yeah, maybe this is something you get into in the book, anyways. But you said something interesting about the difficulty organizing people when they're if they're young with kids, and then they try participating in activism and it fails, and then they're like I've got to make ends meet. So you said that, like, one idea then is to think about how you schedule meetings and things like that. I was kind of reminded of, there's been a lot of stuff written lately on poverty especially, but the whole, what you were recommending sounded a lot like the kind of nudge folks who say, oh, what people have, poverty like destroys people's ability to think and does all these horrible things to them. So we'll hire people to help them fill out their welfare forms, or we'll think about how to schedule, the welfare office to support them, but we'll still keep them on $600 a month. Couldn't there be a lesson here as well for the labor movement that we should be, number one priority should be restoring the eye? I don't know, like tuition to me doesn't seem like the high on that list. And I come from a pretty humble background, and I went to university and I'm not, anyways, I shouldn't get into that, but tuition, fine, it's in there somewhere, but it seems like we should be fighting for things like higher welfare rates, restoring EI, guaranteed annual income, which I've been disappointed to see people label as neoliberal just because they're conservatives like Milton Friedman, who've had their own conception of that. But without that material security, people with the minimum wage, they're working 2 jobs.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you can really do with scheduling. It's going to make much of a difference.
Well, but that's within a workplace, right? That's people who are unionized currently, and they have a job, and it's like, hey, we meet every day at 5. My childcare finishes at 5. I'm not going to go to the meeting. Like those structural barriers that I think that women workers, that racialized workers, that the people have been fighting, workers with disabilities, that people have been fighting to try and remove some of those barriers to participation. But obviously, scheduling a meeting within a union to workers who are unemployed is 2 different things, right? I think, targeting the broader social programs, there's no question about it. But some of the problems with it is for young people, those programs are theoretical until you need them. And so when you talk to young people who are in school about student debt, okay, so student debt, $36,000 when you graduate on average with credit cards and stuff, and you say, this is going to be a problem. And they're like, yeah, I totally think that it will be a problem. It's like, what we actually need to do is former students paying their debt and being like, oh wow, I pay the equivalent of rent every single month to the government for a degree that didn't get me a job, right? And so there has to be a totally different way that we rethink about, we think about these programs, because it's not good enough to say, like, we're going to fight for more maternity benefits for someone who's like a 19-year-old guy who has no idea what the hell that means, for example, right? For workers who have experience with that, I think absolutely the labor movement has to do whatever it can. I think on EI specifically, the changes that are coming to EI are going to be, they're going to destroy the program. There's no question about that.
So why can't students care about the condition of the poor? Like, plenty of them are studying economics and public policy, and even the ones who aren't.
I think they should.
You could have a more outwardly focused student movement. I mean, not.
Well, the positions of the student movement are the positions taken by students. Like I guess I do graduate in two weeks for my master's, but I'm kind of out of that these days. But certainly, like when you're talking to students well, I organize in a major city. A lot of our campaigns were around cuts to ODSP, which is Ontario's People with Disability Program, and cuts to other social programs that our students accessed, or to be able to get those programs while getting OSAP, which is the Provincial Student Loans Program. So those things are happening. I don't know enough about British Columbia to say if the students at UBC have made EI a banner issue, but no. But there's nothing in my book that says that that's bad. No.
I just wanted, I'm not from the labor at all, but I guess I'm a tangent person, just sort of looking in. So maybe my point of view will be very tangent. But I was just reading a lot about how the baby boomer generation isn't retiring, and that's sort of part of the problem in passing the baton to the next generation. That's just one point on it. But I also think within that generation there's a real possible ignorance, not necessarily completely across the board, of just what it's been like for the generations after them. And to the point of, like, I've made pretty much the same wage when I was 14 as I make now at 45. And I've never had the benefit or support of a community like the labor. So, like, how many people are just going, like, who are you people?
Yeah. No, and that's such a good point. I actually presented last night in Winnipeg to labor leaders, and they were talking about what kind of language the labor movement uses to talk to people, and this whole thank the labor movement for the weekend and all this kind of stuff. It comes off to a lot of people, especially who aren't unionized, as being like, well, aren't you lucky? That's great, because I don't have that. And when you talk about who are the people most affected by that, it is younger workers, obviously, because it's younger workers who find themselves in those precarious jobs, who are not going to be unionized, who can't even get 20 hours a week at their job, and so then they're figuring out how to have a piecemeal life with 3 or 4 different part-time jobs. And so I think that the labor movement, part of the reason for why the labor movement talks like that is the lack of those workers' voices there. There are some unions doing amazing work organizing retail workers. I think like UFCW is doing really amazing work organizing retail workers. But the labor movement has to see workers who are not members of the labor movement as being their responsibility too. right? When we fight for changes to employment standards, when we fight for social programs like EI, those are for all workers. And I think that the labor movement needs to figure out new ways to be able to compel the government into doing those kinds of social program changes to improve the lives of all workers, regardless of their membership in a union.
Well, that would be nice. And I mean, those ideals of equality seem like the baton got dropped.
Yeah.
Frankly, by that generation. And
Yeah.
that pissed off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I think that there's, I mean, it's, you know, to say that yes, that is the case or no, I think it's hard, but I can definitely think of examples. Like, I know that locally there was a rally last week of a group, and it was organized by, I think, Unifor, with some local workers who were low-wage cleaning staff, basically who a new service provider for the cleaning staff has been taken under contract, and the effect is going to be that the workers are going to see their wages drop by $1.50 an hour from $12 to $10.50. You know, and these are mostly women who are newer immigrants to Canada, taking care of their families. The company that the contractor works for, Cadillac Fairview, is wholly owned by the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good example of where these cracks are, where, you know, a generation that has worked very hard to build something for themselves, for their families, to protect, you know, to say, you know, to build this kind of upwardly mobile lifestyle, you know, where there's then a place where they're failing to do that with other people too.
But they also own the Leafs.
Pardon? Yeah.
There's a quite successful union project in New Zealand that I've got, you know, by virtue of a couple visits to the country. They've largely organized the service industry, fast food, stores in the shopping malls, hotel and casinos. There are about 10,000 members now, which proportional to Canada would be a union here of about 80,000 members. And it began in the year 2004, had some difficult moments, but they've had, I think, some of the only strikes in the world at places like McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Starbucks, and that's chain-wide in the country. And what I've seen, I've done some writing on this because I've been so impressed, is two real keys that have made them successful. One is they've had three key demands that appeal to any worker regardless of where they're at. A $12 minimum wage, which actually has become $13.50 because they've won that and now they keep going. Minimum hours of work per week. Minimum guaranteed hours, so the employer can't play with who gets work this week or not. And benefits, and there's a third that escapes me for the moment. So it's been successful in appealing to workers where they're at, but also it's basically founded by political radicals, the union. So they have a broader vision for the whole working class and labor movement as well. So for example, as soon as they got on their feet, they began to reach out to the rest of the union movement to campaign for an increase in the national minimum wage for everybody. And then they've been taking on the kind of social programs and issues that you've been talking about as well. So I think there's a lot to learn from that experience, and there may be others like it in places I don't know about. Probably in Europe, there's, you know, some union projects that have been quite successful. And I think if I look quickly in the book, and you talk about what seems some of the really significant campaigns that are beginning to develop in the United States.
Oh yeah.
So I'm encouraged by that. I'm a little skeptical of the projects where the established unions that are part of the status quo, that's sort of getting us into trouble in the first place, are now going to go out and lead the change. So for me, the book is out in Unifor. I wish it all success, and there's some original ideas there. But I think above all, there has to be, for a new union movement, a vision for society, that we're not in this so I get a better wage. We want better welfare. We want students not to be indebted, but, you know,
Yeah.
EI and pensioners. If this labor movement today called a rally in Ottawa in a month for significant increases to the Canada Pension Plan, how many tens of thousands of people would they have? They did this in the 80s. It was a movement called Grey Power, and it scared the pants off the Conservative government of the day. So, so that kind of broader vision, which I hear you talking about in your presentation, I'm very encouraged, and I'm very interested now in reading the book.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that some of the stuff that's happening in the United States is really amazing. Like the Our Walmart campaign is coordinated by SEIU, the Services Employee International Union, but they're not trying to unionize the workers. They're trying to give the workers an organization. They're trying to get the workers to come together and act like a union. And even that is scaring the hell out of Walmart, and they're demanding very basic things and very similar things like higher minimum wage. and more hours. The fast food workers strike in New York City, where they're demanding $15 an hour minimum wage, is incredible. I talk about the hot and crusty cafe workers in New York City, which is a cafe where mostly people without status working there, who are having their wages stolen and facing harassment at work, and were not making minimum wage. They actually unionized. They occupied the hot and crusty cafe with solidarity from it was very close to a university, and so faculty members and students were able to help buoy their picket line, and they won. They actually won the cafes. They were fired briefly, and then the cafe reinstated them. So there are some really amazing things happening. I really struggled to find amazing things happening in Canada. I really, really did. I felt so awful about that, but I did. But I when I say that building the new union movement, I don't think Jerry Dias is going to be the president of the new union movement, right? The president of Unifor. I don't think that it is going to be the current leadership, and this is why I think that we do need to start finding new ways to organize young people, because they will not, at convention, they'll be the ones that won't stand for the status quo. They'll be the ones that will say, no, 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 we want an open election, or no, 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 we want to present ourselves forward, or whatever. So I think that's probably good. I see there's still sushi, so the night's not over, but perhaps it is for me standing here. But thank you so much, and if you want to talk to me after, you can, or if you want to reach me, my email is super simple, it's just my name at Gmail. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.